Good evening. It's a blessing that we can all be back again this evening, and it's a blessing anytime we have an opportunity to worship God together and encourage and edify one another. I'm excited. As I said this morning, it always excites me every time we end a topic that we've been speaking on, a topic that we've been discussing. It's always exciting to me every time that we reach a new point in our studies together. And we have been doing a very good study on the book of Ruth, and specifically on Ruth and Boaz and Naomi and the different aspects of their lives that we can take and emulate. I'm excited because not only are we seeing a new chapter to this story that we've been going through, the story of Ruth, but we're also seeing the conclusion, the highlight, the importance. Why does the book of Ruth matter? Why does Ruth and Naomi matter at all? This morning's lesson ended kind of with this note. Why is Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz important? This evening's text, if you want to go ahead and be turning over to it, is Ruth chapter 4, verses 11 through 22. And the title of this lesson is Blessings and Redemption. I so titled this lesson because we have already seen the redemption take place. We have already seen Boaz redeem Ruth. We have already seen all that they had to go through to get there. And now we're just going to look at the fruit of their labor. Now we're going to look at the blessings that came out of what Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz all went through and all that they did to make this possible. If you will, read with me there in Ruth chapter 4, beginning in verse 11. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. Thank you for following along in that reading with me. This evening, we're going to see a conclusion, actually, to the judicial proceedings that we looked at this morning, the blessing that all the elders of the town, the witnesses, bestowed upon Boaz. And then we're going to transition into the actual redemption that took place and the blessings that are found in that redemption. And then lastly, we're going to look at the salvation that was provided by this redemption. First, blessings are of great importance. In our Genesis class this morning, we actually talked about this in great detail, about how important blessings were and why blessings were so valued by people of this time and in this area. One thing that sets this blessing apart from others is the fact that Ruth was a foreigner. Ruth was someone who had been set apart from the rest of Israel. She would have been someone that would have been separated socially. She would have been someone that would have been alienated from society. And especially in a time like this, when evil things are being done, she would have had a lot of hostility towards her. But because of the type of person she was, she didn't experience those same kinds of hostility. Yet, this foreigner, this Moabitess, she was blessed by the elders of the city of Bethlehem. Not only was she just giving a blessing, but did you notice how she was blessed? The different citations that were made by the elders of the city. They didn't just say, may you be blessed like good people are blessed. They cited the matriarchs of Israel. We said a lot about patriarchs before in classes and in sermons. You don't often hear a lot about the matriarchs, their spouses, their wives. Yet here, that is who these blessings are directed towards Ruth about. May her be like the matriarchs of Israel. May her be fertile. This is interesting. It's interesting to me because Rachel and Leah were prized very highly in Israel because they were the mothers of Israel. How much must have Ruth meant? Even more so, how much did Boaz mean? That they were wishing for his new bride to be like these matriarchs of Israel, these mothers of Israel. And not only that, it's important to know that Bethlehem is a town of David, a town of Judah. This being the town of Judah, they asked that Ruth be blessed like Perez's mother. Like their direct descendants. Their direct line. This is a wonderful blessing to be had. Tamar was as much a mother to Bethlehem as Leah and Rachel were to all of Israel. This interests me so much because this is not just any old Israelite getting this blessing. This is a widow. And while that may not mean much to us because widows are valued in our society, in this society, in this time, widows did not have any real rights, any legal privileges. They were not able to own land in many cases. They were not able to argue for themselves before a city. They were often seen as a lower member of the echelons of society. Now, the reason I say that is not because of the design being that way, but they just kind of fell through the cracks. That was not only true at this time, you even see that up until the time of Christ, where around his ministry, you have these widows being neglected. People were literally taking the money that they should have been giving to these widows, their mothers, their grandmothers, taking that money and saying, I'm giving it to God so I don't have to provide it to you. So much so that it had to be emphasized over and over that they should be valuing widows. What is pure religion? Religion that is pure and undefiled is to visit widows and orphans. When Paul is instructing Timothy on how the affairs of the church are supposed to be ran individually in congregations, he instructs them to show honor to a widow who is a widow indeed. And the honor there is not only respect, it's provision for. The only other individual in his letters that he writes to Timothy that should be shown that same honor, that same provision for, is the elder who also labors in ministry as a preacher. So that way the shepherd and the speaker who was doing both jobs would to be worthy of double honor, which was meaning that he should be compensated for both positions. That's interesting. That those kind of things had to be said, not in regards to the elder, but yet in regard to the widow. It was very common for them to fall through the cracks. And yet this widow, this foreign widow, gets this blessing. This foreign widow is the one whom it is said, let your womb be like the womb of the mothers of this nation, of this people. Let you have the same success as a wife that our founding mothers had. That is amazing. Furthermore, they extol not only her to be like these matriarchs, but they also state they wish for her to be able to build a house for Boaz. Now, that build a house is another colloquial saying, another local way of saying give him children, make a family. It's this idea of providing a home and a family home life. And that's what they desired. So this blessing that is given here is not just some run-of-the-mill blessing. This is not just what a father would say to his son, may you live long, may you prosper, may you have great success in all that you do. This individual was blessed that she'd be like the matriarchs. Blessed that she'd be like the mother of this town. Even more so, this was invoked by the name of Yahweh. Yahweh, the name of the Lord, the one they so feared. In fact, Yahweh isn't even really the real name. That's a pronunciation that was combined from two different ones. That YHVH or YHWH is the tetragrammaton, or 4 letters. That is the consonants for God, His name. Whenever you see Lord capitalized, possibly bolded in your Bible, that's God's name. Yet they were so afraid of uttering His name, since they might take it in vain, that they combined it with another Hebrew word, or at least the vowels of another Hebrew word, Adonai. So when you take the vowels of Adonai and add them to the consonants of YHVH or YHWH, you get Yahweh or Yahweh. And with the Y that is often pronounced as a J because of the Hebrew language, that's where we get the word Jehovah. That's where we get the word Yahweh. They invoked God to bless her. They didn't say, we're going to help you be this way. They said, by the Lord, by His name. That's interesting to me. This isn't just any old blessing. They were not only behind what had happened at these court proceedings that we talked about this morning, but they were wishing them well on their journey as a family and blessing them in their endeavors as a family. The next section here is actually comprised from 2 different people speaking. Number one is the narrator, whoever is penning this particular work. And the other is the women of Bethlehem, speaking specifically to Naomi. Now, the narrator is giving us information as to what is happening and is giving us more information to add to the story. There in verse 13, 16, and 17, the last part of 17, the narrator is speaking and provides the additional information to the women of Bethlehem. Now, the women of Bethlehem are going to make mention not only of Naomi, not only of Ruth, but also of the child. It's interesting that when the narrator is speaking there, he covers the birth, he covers the care of the child, and the climax of this entire line of individuals leading up to David the king. And the women of Bethlehem, on the other hand, they cover some of the more intimate details, you might say. They recognized how great it was for Naomi to have Ruth in her life. They could see that how much of a blessing that Ruth had become to Naomi. Ruth was better to her than many sons. She had lost sons. This meant a lot to her. Yet Ruth had become worth so much more to her because of her faithfulness, because of her love, because of her devotion, because of all the great things that had happened to her because of Ruth and her devotion. The women of Bethlehem are extolling how great a situation that Naomi has. It's very common, especially in poetic literature, to see this, the daughters of Jerusalem, or the daughters of the city, or the women of the city. It's a very common literary style, especially in Hebrew writing. This isn't something that would stand out as odd. This is people of the community say this about Naomi and about the child. what is more interesting to me, how the child is spoken of. Now, an interesting side note I want us to take for a moment that is very important to this text is this idea about Naomi adopting the child. Ruth and Boaz's son was taken upon Naomi's lap, and she nursed him. She took care of him. And some believe that the text insinuates that Naomi adopted the child for legal reasons. And while that was not uncommon, that would have been a very common thing to do for legal reasons, a widow adopting a child. It did not have to happen here. Boaz was taking care of Ruth and Naomi. There was no need for Naomi to adopt this child. By the child being the son of her husband, Ruth's widow, there was no need for Naomi to adopt this child. Her husband's name continued through his son. Whenever this is taking place, whenever Naomi is caring for her grandson, you can see a picture of a grandmother whose life has been rekindled, who has a light back in her eyes. She's lost her husband. She's lost her sons, her children. She's lost her other daughter-in-law. Had to leave her home in Bethlehem to go to Moab. Had to leave her home in Moab to flee back to Bethlehem. And came back feeling that she should no longer be called anything but bitterness, because the Lord had attested to how bitter her life had become. This woman had come so far. Now, where was she? Now she was taking care of her grandson Obed. Now she was with a daughter-in-law and a new son. Now she had a family. Now her husband's line could continue. Ruth had become such a blessing to Naomi. We could only all wish to be a blessing to those around us as Ruth was to her mother-in-law. She became her hope of redemption. Now the story may end here for Ruth and Naomi, yet their impact goes on. Their impact does not stop here. This account of Ruth and Naomi's life records the near loss of a family name, the near loss of a family in Israel. That family was very important. Apart from the fact that God did not want any Israelite family's name to go out, apart from the fact that God valued so much descendants and the seed lines continuing and them having possession of the promise, being the land at this point, apart from that, you have this specific family. The family that would eventually produce the Messiah. The family that would produce the man after God's own heart, David. And then King Solomon, who would extend the kingdom even beyond the vastness that David had already acquired. Who would make his kingdom worldwide in trade routes. That would put Israel on the map. All of this could have been lost. And here, only a few pages amongst the many in your Bible, we have the record how that seed line was saved. We have the record of how that family name was saved. You don't just have the salvation of the line of David coming to the king. There was a greater king to come after him. There was a greater king that was on the docket to come down the line that would do more than just expand the physical realm of Israel. That would do more than just push back the Philistines. That would do more than be a man only after God's heart. There was another individual that came from this line. Jesus was born of the flesh of woman, Mary. Mary, the mother of Jesus, would not have came to being if it had not been for Boaz and Ruth and Naomi. If it had not been for this strong family, we would have no Jesus of Nazareth. Not only would we be missing a great teacher, a great rabbi, a great person that has reformed Judaism, the Sermon on the Mount alone turned Judaism on its head and showed that their interpretation of the law was off. Not only would we have missed all that, but Jesus went a step further. After completing every point of the law, after completely and perfectly fulfilling the law, he abolished it. After fulfilling the prophecies, he made them obsolete. He made the sacrifice that would redeem all mankind. He was the sacrifice that washed away our sins and gave us the ability to contact his blood. Now, what would have happened if Ruth had turned back like Orpah did? What would have happened if Boaz said, I won't redeem, as the other redeemer did? What would have happened had Naomi stayed in the land of Moab where she was, even after hearing that God had returned and visited his people? We wouldn't have a Jesus of Nazareth, at least not by this same line. Could God have accomplished another way? I don't have any doubt in my mind. But this was his plan, and this is the way he had to do it. The way that he had laid out from the foundations of the world for it to take place. And it wouldn't have been possible without each and every one of those individuals and the decisions they made. This morning, I left us with an idea, with a thought. Can one person change the world? Can one individual make a difference? The choices that one individual makes, can that really affect anything? How did Ruth and Boaz affect the world? How did Naomi change things for the better? Just by being a good mother-in-law. How did Ruth change things by being a good daughter-in-law? By being a good person. How did Boaz change things for the better? By having a loving and compassionate heart and being willing to redeem and do his duty as an Israelite. The thought I want to leave each and every one of us with is not, what can God do for me? Because God has done everything for me. He has provided me with blessings which are unmatched, which I could not return in 1,000 years, no matter what I'd done. God has provided me with redemption. The real question is, what decisions am I going to make? How am I going to live my life? Is it going to be in doing what was best for me, as the other Redeemer did? Is it going to be in doing what makes me feel good? Or am I going to try to be like Boaz? Am I going to try to be like Ruth or Naomi? Am I going to try to stand up and make a difference? Because it always starts with one. It always starts with one individual. Gary Hampton was the dean of the school when I went to school back in Knoxville. Great man, a great minister, a great student of the Bible. He had a lesson that he preached one time when we were in Alabama on our recruiting trip, recruiting support for the school and also prospective students. We got to make this trip alone, him and I, and it was a great trip and I enjoyed it. But what really stood out to me was the lesson he gave. The power of one. He told a story of one individual. This individual was a Christian lady. And she eventually convinced her husband to read the Bible and be saved. And he was. And then the story went down telling of all the people, each individual down the chain link affected. Some were great preachers. Some helped lead lots of people to Christ. Some of them, we would recognize their names if I was to speak them. And eventually it got down to a woman who taught her son the gospel. And that son was Gary Hampton. What impact can one person have? If it hadn't have been for that one wife way back down the line, then Gary Hampton, this instructor, the dean of the school, wouldn't have been led to Christ, at least not that way. What impact can one individual have? What can you do in this small town of Campbell? You can make a world of difference. You just have to choose to make it. If you want to make a decision tonight to stop doing things for you, to stop living for me and I, and to start living for God, to start trying to make a difference, not only here in Campbell, but in the world, won't you do that right now while we stand and sing together?